We are talking Quest for the Mighty Sword. This is a 1990 sword and sorcery movie directed by Joe D'Amato. Now this is actually the fourth in the Ator series. The Ator series of movies does have a somewhat convoluted history, so allow me to give you a brief explainer. So the original Ator movie was a direct response to the success of Conan the Barbarian, and the kind of these Italians wanted to kind of cash in on the success, and thus they made Ator, the first movie starring Miles O'Keeffe and directed by Joe D'Amato. Joe D'Amato followed it up with the second Ator movie, once again starring Miles O'Keeffe, and this one obviously to coincide with Conan the Destroyer. Now, because there was no third Conan movie, Joe D'Amato left the series, and it was actually still picked up by another director. In this case, he made The Iron Warrior, and that's actually my favourite out of the Ator movies. Once again, kind of starring Miles O'Keeffe, but kind of a separate entry, not really so much a follow-on from the first two movies. However, Joe D'Amato came back for a fourth Ator movie, which kind of somewhat again kind of reinvented the franchise, but this time Miles O'Keeffe did not return, and this was Ator was actually going to play by a different actor, Allan Kramer, who you may know who played Thor in the Incredible Hulk Returns TV movie. Now this one kind of essentially kind of reboots the series, having this being Ator's son's kind of movie. And now Ator is in the film, the original Ator is in the film at the beginning, but he's kind of dies fairly on, and his son is kind of the kind of central character, although they're both played by Allan Kramer here. And this has a somewhat of a little bit of a history in its own, because of the kind of shenanigans behind the scenes. So this movie has a number of different titles. It is actually the fourth Ator movie, but it's sometimes referred to as the third, because the fourth one was kind of made by a different director, and it's somewhat of a, you know, alternate kind of timeline, so to speak. So sometimes it's known as Ator 3. It is also known as the Hobgoblin, because they actually used the leftover prosthetics from the Troll 2 movie, which means it's also known as Troll 3, because it uses the same makeup, basically, the same kind of rubber suits from the Troll 2 movie. So it has a little bit of a sort of convoluted story. So anyway, what is the story of this movie, you're asking? Let me get to it. So as I've mentioned, this actually focuses on the son of Ator, who is also called Ator, and is played by the same actor as the original Ator in this film, but a different one to the other three films. Woo! Anyway, and he is, on his 18th birthday, is meant to receive this magical sword that was broken in a kind of a duel by his father and kind of a bad guy some years earlier. And he's been kind of raised by this Hobgoblin sort of character, and he goes on a kind of a number of different sort of adventures, almost rescuing a goddess from this kind of where she's trapped, then ultimately fighting off this king who has designs on his new girlfriend. So what do we think of this movie? What can I say that works in this film? It's rather bizarre, I have to say. This movie is interesting because the narrative, there's not really one sort of flowing narrative. There's almost three, and obviously the three kind of acts of this movie have their own kind of storyline. The first act being it's kind of Ator trying to escape this kind of hobgoblin that has kind of brought him up. It seems like it's very convoluted as to why that has happened. So yeah, the first kind of half an hour is Ator trying to get the kind of the magic sword and escape this kind of little hobgoblin creature. The second is him trying to kind of rescue this kind of damsel in distress from this kind of tomb kind of where she's been sort of trapped in. And then the third is him rescuing her a second time from this king who has kind of kidnapped her, who has wants to have sexy times and things like that. So the narrative here is kind of broken up somewhat, which kind of makes it bite-sized chunks, but it really kind of ultimately kind of lacks real narrative flow. But yeah, so it's an interesting kind of like movie in regards to its kind of setup. The movie doesn't really make a lot of sense on a narrative sense at all. There is quite a lot of outdoor photography with kind of men in kind of armor, lots of kind of props used here. A lot of them are kind of clearly kind of reused from other projects, things like that. I think Allan Kramer is quite a... He makes a more of a fun Ator, though he's not as quite as stoic or as kind of as dangerous you really kind of feel here. There are some quite, I'm not going to say amusing kind of sequences here where Ator will fight off against all sorts of things, including what looks like a kind of a Godzilla, but kind of man-sized, complete with kind of breathing fire. A kind of a robot which has these kind of like these two bodies attached to one, and various kind of soldiers and trolls and things. There's a reasonable amount of amusing kind of special effects kind of here and there, and there's lots of kind of you know, damsels in distress. All of look very kind of glamorous. There's kind of a subplot involving his mother. So it's a bit of a weird one, this film. I can't honestly say it's a good film, to be honest, but there's certainly some odd and sort of interesting elements within the film. What doesn't work, I've got to say, I prefer Miles O'Keefe as Ator. Even though I think the Allan Kramer version seems a little bit more kind of, a little bit more like his Thor persona in the Hulk Returns, to be honest with you. A little bit more kind of like emotive, should we say. I mean, Miles O'Keefe, not the best actor, and he played it very kind of stoically. Here the Ator is a much more expressive, but I just don't know. He just didn't really have that kind of, that cool, calculated kind of factor that I think Miles O'Keefe brought to the role. So I do prefer Miles O'Keefe in this as the kind of the Ator sort of character, but you know, he ultimately becomes a little bit generic, to be honest with you. And I have to say, some of the kind of the props here look very kind of unwieldy. This kind of mighty sword looks horrible. It's a horribly designed kind of sword. Looks really kind of bulky and unwieldy, to be quite honest with you. The movie really doesn't make any sense. I mean, the first act of this movie, where we have this kind of prologue where we see Daddy Ator kind of have this duel for some reason. It's really not explained, and he kind of just lets some guy spear him. It doesn't really make any sense. And then for some reason, his mother gives him up to this kind of Hobgoblin who was the one that killed the father, and who knows? It just doesn't make any sense. So the movie just has these kind of like silly reasons to go from one scene to the next, basically. I mean, why this kind of, this Hobgoblin hasn't just killed Ator when he clearly knows that Ator has tried to kill him at some point. It doesn't make any kind of sense. This movie just is completely kind of nonsensical. And I have to say as well, considering this is a movie from 1990, it looks like a movie from 1980, I have to say. It really feels like it's an earlier film than it actually is. It feels very kind of like low tech, and for a 1990 film, it just doesn't feel like a film of its time, if that makes sense. It just feels like very kind of basic in terms of it. This feels like it's just a kind of like a very quickly thrown together movie, and dare I say, not as memorable as even the original kind of three Ator movies, and not as fun, not as cheesy. This one just feels more kind of dull, unfortunately. It's not as, I mean, the Ator films are renowned as crappy films, to be honest, but I think you can revel in their kind of their funny cheesiness. This one is just boring and dull. And because you don't really have much in the way of character, and because the story is so kind of weird and kind of disjointed, there's no real flow to it. And some of the supporting characters are kind of introduced, nothing is done with them, and then they're kind of out again. It's just an all-round kind of little bit of a wet squib, this one. I'm going to have to be honest with you, this is, in my opinion, the worst out of the Ator movies. It's just not interesting. As crappy as the original Ator movies are, and I still actually genuinely quite like the third one, to be honest, the only one that isn't directed by Joe Tomato. I still kind of enjoy them in a funny way. This one I don't enjoy. I'm going to give this one a 2 out of 10. It's pretty poor. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.